Okay, so our speaker today, our presenter today is Professor Ruth de Villiers, who has a lot of experience in what she'll be discussing with you today. She just happened to also have been the supervisor for my PhD studies.
Very smart student.
So the two of us like each other, you know, but yeah, all right. So I've been with her then for a number of years because my PhD took quite a while. Not her fault, my fault. But she has very good experience in a lot of academic activities. I'm sure she will introduce herself a bit in terms of her background. But she was at UNISA at that stage, and I was doing my search. So she will be discussing all sorts of aspects related to academic writing in general. Okay, when you're writing your dissertation, it's not the same as writing a novel. Okay? You can't come up with all sorts of wishy-washy statements. So when you see Prof. Ruth, you see golden thread. Okay? So she's going to tell you today about the golden thread.
Yeah, you're giving away my secret.
No.
One of the presentations says it's all joined by a question mark. So now that question you'll all get 10 out of 10 for.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Hello everybody, it's always super to come to TUT. Is that okay if I move here?
Yes.
Great. It's always super to be here. I come each year and I always enjoy it. And what I'm so excited about today is that you're a whole lot of people. Now my main computing degree was in information systems, which is like what you guys are very modern and call informatics. I want to know who's from informatics. Wow, you're a good crowd, hey? Okay, what about IT? Yeah, that's also one of my specializations because my main research area and the area in which I've worked is e-learning, and that's all about the learning technologies. And then we've got these hardcore guys, the computer science people. Let's see who you are. Wow, also a lot. Last year I was so impressed by the subjects that some of these computer science people were doing, the prototyping and the simulations and the conceptual models. Very difficult, I think, to do a theoretical PhD, but a number of you were doing it. And now I have not asked about engineering, computer engineering. Wow, well it looks like it's about the same of each lot. So I'm going to fire away, talking about academic writing. And I always like to have a kind of a theme in what I do. So I decided on a theme of a structure. So this is the high-level design. I happen to be married to an architect, and I have a son who's an architect. So there's a lot of talk about design and foundations, and sketch plans, and site plans, and working drawings. Well, I would like to suggest that this first one, the high-level design, is like the sketch plan, because I'm just going to fly through what you would have in, and let me enlarge it. There we go. So I'm going to fly through what you would have in a proposal or in a dissertation or even in an article, the fundamental sections that are there. And am I right in understanding most of you are going to be at proposal stage? So what you're going to find is that a lot of this stuff today, you'll think, oh my word, you know, that's really scary. But you see, it's here to help you in the future. And these slides, you will get copies of all of them. I have already sent the first draft to Prof. Etienne, but sometimes when I talk, I make a few little changes. So you will get them all. And they are your takeaway, your take-home from this talk. And when you start writing the big book, the dissertation, then remember to start looking at them, especially presentation 2, because that's got a lot of low-level details about writing, about the syntax, the semantics, the linking, connecting, and so on. So I'm going to fly away right now with the high-level design, and I'm calling it the generic structure of a thesis or dissertation. So these are not actually necessarily your chapter headings, although they might be, but they are all the things that you need. Okay, so these are definitely the things that your proposal will have and that your dissertation. And one day in the future, when you write journal articles or a conference paper, probably the same. So we will have an introduction. Each one I'll deal with in more detail. It's very important to have a background or context. What area are you working in? Don't just fly into your research question. Tell the people what area you're working in. Then, of course, research design and methodology, very important. And I know you're going to have talks on that later in the year. Literature review. Prof. Etienne said to you, that's coming next week. So now you see today, in what you're doing today is you're getting the overall picture. Next week, home in on literature review. And then, of course, your data collection and analysis, which is also what we call results. Sometimes we don't actually have the same sort of empirical data collection. Empirical data collection is a survey, observation, collecting data, perhaps secondary data, of a main database. But if you're one of these really clever people who's doing something conceptual, your data collection may be from other literature. But whatever it is, you collect your data, you analyze it, and you discuss it. You interpret it. You tell us what it says to you, how it's relevant to your work, what are the big findings of your data collection, and then you move on to a conclusion. So let's take these things one at a time. But before that, there's just a little note to remind you of what I've already said to you, that the content that I suggest for each section is just a general indication. What your headings are depends on your topic and your discipline, how mathematical it is, how textual it is, what you're doing, your particular study. And so what I say is, though, everything I'm going to talk about today, you do need to address it. But it can be, the headings will vary. Those ones I gave you in the previous slide, they may well be a set of basic headings. But what you do may differ. But what's the really important thing is that everything I'm going to... Whoop! I realized what you said about walking around. I mustn't get excited and walk. Okay, you do need the middle bullet to address each one of these, but maybe in a different... Some of you will put it in introduction, some of you will put it in context. You get the idea. You just need to work with each one of those. And particularly at the beginning, if you have a background section, some of the stuff that goes there might be what somebody else puts into the introduction. Somebody else might put it into their problem statement. But now let's go back to your introduction. You need to start with a powerful sentence. A lot of proposals and dissertations start with, the aim of this study is to investigate. Now that's very true, but it could be a bit more exciting. So let's pretend that your topic is road to rail. I have just driven out here this morning and I've been weaving between trucks, and sometimes you overtake a truck in the second lane, and when you get past it you actually see there is another huge one in the left-hand lane, and it's really, they cause a number of accidents on our road, and they certainly do slow us down. But okay, we understand that there's a lot of complications in putting your goods on rail, because you've still got to have a truck to go to the station, and when you get to the other end you need another truck. So people these days say, no, trucks are the way to go. Nevertheless, there is a movement called road to rail, in which people are pressurizing for the railways to find a way of meeting needs to get some of the traffic off the roads. Now, I want to pretend that that's the topic and give you an idea of what I mean. Oh, Etienne, thank you so much. You probably had to walk a mile to find that.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, enjoy your lecture. Right. So, we could start off. This study investigates getting traffic off the roads and onto the railway lines. Absolutely true. But I want to talk to you about a powerful sentence. How about something like this? Heavy trucks on the highways and roads cause congestion, slowdowns, and sometimes major accidents. Immediately, do you understand? That kind of draws your attention. It's a kind of an oh wow sentence. And then after that, you're welcome to do as much as you like about the aim of this study is to wow wow. But just start with a sentence that catches people's attention. And so, if I sit here, I can see you. We can just move these. There we go. Am I close enough? Okay, just tell me if I wander too much. Right. So then what you do in the introduction is, once you've given a powerful introduction that catches our attention and we say, yes, that's true, then you can move on to the purpose of your study and your environment. We have a focus area and an application area. The focus area, what have I crashed now? Oh, it's just my lunch, it will survive. Don't worry, it's only bread sandwiches. The focus area. Yeah, let's put all those things over that side. Yeah, the focus area is the domain in which you are studying. For our road to rail study, the domain would be what we call transport logistics, which falls partially under computing and also under economic studies. So you will say what your focus area is. For this it would be transport issues, transport logistics, and then your environment, the application area. And what's your application? Your application area is to reduce the number of large trucks and lorries on our roads. So you get it. Focus, anybody has had an aha moment and they're thinking, okay, my focus area is this, that's my domain. And you see your domain is much narrower than information systems or computer engineering. It's much closer. That's what I said in mine, it's transport. Anybody would like to say what they think their focus area is, or are you not sure of your proposals yet? You are sure? You're not sure? Not sure. Okay, right. Then let's take another one. One of my areas was human-computer interaction. So I would say the focus of this study is human-computer interaction with small devices. Okay? Not laptop, not a big mainframe if they exist anymore, but small devices. And what's my application area? The actual one I'm doing, it is on learning lessons on smartphones. So you get the idea. Focus area, human-computer interaction on small devices. Application area is learning on smartphones. So that is very important. You know, you put in a sentence like that, and the person who's examining it knows right away what you're doing and where they're heading. And then your problem statement. Your problem statement is critical. So for the one that I've told you, I did say you would have that powerful sentence at the beginning, which just said that trucks and lorries are causing congestion, accidents and slowdowns. But when you get to the real world problem statement, you will have a nicely phrased sentence on the problem and a lot more detail. You might even back it up with some statistics and so on, but there you really, a problem statement is not a one sentence story. It is probably at least a page in which you go into detail on your problem. If I was talking about the learning on smartphones, then I would probably say how we are living in a world where devices are mobile and learners are mobile. And therefore, if we can provide a learner with something that they can take with them everywhere, it has huge advantages. It's good for distance learning. It's good for reviewing when you're out of class. So you get the picture. You sort of talk in detail about your problem there. Your aims and objectives, and you may well have some supervisors and universities like a research question and sub-questions. Others go for aims and objectives. I have seen a number of dissertations, because I also examine dissertations from all over the country, where they have a set of research questions and a set of objectives. And there's pretty much a one-to-one association between them, and perhaps it's not necessary, but you do what your university wants, what your supervisor wants. Also in the introduction, you will talk, and by the way, here you're just touching on it. It's not your aims and objectives, because this isn't your research methodology chapter, but you're just making it very clear. You're so setting the foundation that the person who's examining it says, okay, so that's what they're doing, and these are the sub-areas they are developing, and their research design, just briefly mention it. It's going to come in the research design section of a proposal or chapter. If it's a dissertation, it will come there later. But very good idea to mention in the introduction, so that they know you are, for example, using action research, or you're going to be prototyping, you're going to be building something in the lab, and you will have 2 prototypes. Not a big deal. Don't bore anybody at that point with research design, because there's a special place for it. But just so we know, is it action research? Is it a survey? Is it an online study of information that is in large databases or in information kiosks? Or is it prototyping? A couple of sentences. Brief mention of research design. Okay, now if you're doing a theoretical study, you may well have a conceptual model that you're working on. Let's say you're working on technology acceptance. If you're ever working on how people accept technology, you will come across TAM, which was developed by Davis a long time ago, and that is Technology Acceptance Model. TAM, I think, came out in the late 1990s, but since then there's been a TAM 2 and a TAM 3. And a lot of people who are working perhaps on technology acceptance of something, let's say you're actually working on students' acceptance of M-learning, of an M-learning environment on their smartphone. And you might want to find out how they accept it. At this point, you wouldn't be interested in what they learn from it and what their exam marks would be, but just how they feel about it. Are they comfortable? In other words, their acceptance, their attitude. And therefore, you would use TAM, Technology Acceptance Model, as your conceptual model. But definitely not all studies have an underlying conceptual model. As you study your domain and the details of your context more and more, you will find out. But that's why I said brief mention of underlying theoretical framework or model, if there is one. And then, of course, the scope. In what detail are you going to go? Let's go back to the road to rail study. Are you going to study the whole of South Africa? Possibly not. That is big. You would probably actually focus. Let's say you focus on the Johannesburg to Durban. Right. You're going to focus, that's the N3, right? To Durban? Yes. So you would say you're going to focus on the N3. So that is what I mean by your domain and your scope. And then your limit, your assumptions, if you have an underlying conceptual model, like you have a constructivist approach or behaviorist approach, or it's a completely non-human study, it's totally laboratory work in the engineering lab, then you give that domain that's where you will be. Also, if you have a conceptual thing, if you have a behaviorist, a constructivist, or a pragmatic foundation, mention that. Limitations are very important, what you're not going to do. And so yes, do mention your limitations in your chapter 1. You can see at the moment I'm definitely moving beyond proposal, aren't I? I'm talking to you about your actual dissertation. But also a very good idea to put the limitations in the last chapter. Shall I tell you why? Because the examiner will look at it, and they've pretty much forgotten what's in the introduction, but in the introduction you said, these are the limitations, I can only work as far as this, these are my exclusions, right? And then when they come to the end of it, they say, well, yeah, nice work, but why didn't they do that? But guess what? You'd already said at the beginning, as an exclusion, that is beyond the scope of the study. So you are covered. But as I say, very often when they get to the end, they kind of forget what was at the beginning, and so it's a good idea to give your limitations and exclusions at the beginning and at the end. You will touch on your research design and methodology in a proposal, and in the dissertation you'll have a whole big chapter on it. And that is where you will talk about your philosophy, if you have one, and then you will give your main research question, which usually has sub-questions that go with it. And by answering all the sub-questions, you get an answer to the main one. But the main one is very important, and there is a very close connection between your problem statement and your main research question. The next bullet is about if you have a theoretical framework or model. I've already mentioned that, but obviously in the section of your proposal or later on of your dissertation, you do need to expand on what theoretical models you will be using if you have such. Normally, if you just do a survey, which happens a lot in informatics, there may well not be a conceptual model. Your data collection methods, what are they? Survey, interview, secondary data from, let's say you're walking, something we're having a lot of problems with now is water supply. I believe there's a water supply problem here today. Let's say that you are working on municipal water supply, right? And on computer technology to give us a very detailed update at any point in time, what the situation is like in any reservoir, and maybe on a mobile device, so that anybody working in that field doesn't have to go back to the office to find out, which has happened recently, that the reservoir on the top of the Constantia Park Hill in Pretoria East ran dry. And so, what are your data collection methods for that? That's not about surveys, that's not about interviews or observation. That is about your data comes from databases. And somebody might try and get that sort of information from a number of municipalities to see how they stay in touch with their water problem, what computer technology they've got to assist them. So that is another data collection method, secondary data from existing databases. And then, of course, your participants and sampling. Maybe you're doing a non-human study, but if you're doing a human study, you do need to say about how many participants you plan to have and how you will acquire them. Convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, or take a population and perhaps, let's say, this is a supermarket study, you're doing something about retail. Then you're going to send your survey by means of SurveyMonkey to every manager of, let's say, Pick n Pay in the country. You know perfectly well that if you get a 25% response, you're actually doing quite well. If you get 50 or 60, it's marvelous. But in that case, your sample is the population. So you get the idea. Just make it very clear exactly how you plan to get participants and what kind of participants you want. Oopsie, see that one says, last time I gave this talk, well, it was at UNISA. Your ethical clearance at your institution is essential. I'm sure you have that at TUT. But that's not all. You also have to get authorization from the institution you are working with. Let's say you're working on road to rail. I believe that the South African Railway Network now has a strange name, and I'm not sure what it stands for. I think it's PRASA. Am I right? Right. You cannot go researching into PRASA unless you have authorization from PRASA. If you're going to be dealing with retail strategies, you are going to need to get permission from Pick n Pay or whatever. If you are going to be investigating the machinery in a certain factory process line because you want to do a prototype for a more efficient method of handling one part of it, then you need authorization from that factory. And then at the back of your thesis there will be, in an appendix, 2 ethical clearance certificates, one from TUT and one from your organization. But as I say, you may not all have an organization. If it's a theoretical study, you still have to get ethical clearance from your institution, but it's usually just a checklist that will say, does this research involve animals, does it involve humans, does it involve sensitive issues like HIV, AIDS, that sort of thing. So we all need to get ethical clearance now for any research study. I'm not going to say a lot about the literature review because you're going to get a real hands-on with that next week. But what is important to put in your literature study? Definitely the definitions of the concept you are working with, and name the theoretical concepts. Very often definitions are of single units. A concept is when you pull things together. You overview the domain. You can give various perspectives. If you were working on road to rail, you would obviously want to read literature not just of the people who say get it on the rail, but you've got to present the other viewpoint as well. The people who say, look, the advantages of having my heavy goods on road far outweigh, even if it's a little bit more expensive, it far outweighs the advantages of the other. I'll take your question now. So you've got to give perspectives, the opposite side of your story as well. Yes, sir?
So in the previous slide about ethical clearance.
Ethical clearance, yes.
I want to know what's the option if, for example, your study was not cleared enough, you couldn't get ethical clearance. Do you quit the study or do you find other ways to send it?
It's a very good question. I think if I had that problem, I would first go back to the committee who turned me down and say, but this is the subject I want to return. Where are the weak spots? Will you give me 6 weeks to change my proposal? I think that's what I would do. But obviously, it's an institutional thing. I'm not part of TUT. You need to speak to the people at TUT and say, do you feel that this study can be saved if I eliminate that part? You'll have to ask, because obviously this study is close to your heart. It's what you want to do. And you don't want to wipe it out. But you have to ask them, well, is this a conditional refusal or is it an outright refusal? If it's an outright refusal, then it's a pity. To use our architecture and building metaphor, it's back to the drawing board, right back to an empty drawing board to find another one. But maybe the issues they are concerned about are things that can be solved. What do you think would be the situation in the case you have in mind?
Okay, for example, at some point I needed to come up with...
Can you speak a bit louder?
At some point I asked myself, why is it that, for example, you pass a certain road every day, whether it's police, and you're sober, and they don't stop you. Every time you're not sober, they stop you. so I needed to find out how do they see this? Is it your driver pattern?
Yeah.
Or whatever. So this cannot be tested because it requires a ground driver to test it. Then you cannot have ground drivers on the road.
Yeah, so it's a very valid question. It's a very interesting point of view. How do they identify drunk drivers? But you can't do an experiment, yes. I think that there must be certain signs they're looking for, but have you been refused ethical clearance for that, or is it just a hypothetical question?
Yeah, I didn't write anything, but I was discussing with this guy and said,
yeah. Yes, I understand. Look, I think you've got to, because I would have thought you could have interviewed the traffic cops. Get permission from the municipality to interview them and speak to them and say, what are the signs you look for?
How would I validate that?
You would have to ask, you would have to say, I'll be with you now, madam, you have to say that this is what you want to study and that the participants, the only people who can answer that question are actually the cops, right? because they're the ones who do it. And so you would need to interview them. And you'd have to lay it out very clearly. And ethical clearance is not just a quick thing, it's quite detailed. But you would have to first give it a try. But also, I'm not sure, does that actually fall into computing? Isn't that more of a human behavior issue? So I'm not sure that that study would apply to any of you, because I'm not sure that a computer would determine it as the cars come flying past.
I was going to develop something that was going to be in the car itself to see how it moves when the car is rocking.
Okay. So you actually want to do a prototype? Yeah. In other words, then there's a computer that does it, not just the cop's eyes.
Yeah, because in this case, it would just be theoretically feasible.
Yeah.
With no way to validate what they say unless we say.
You want to be. You want evidence. Yes. Yes. But you haven't tried for ethical clearance yet.
No.
Well, I wish you all the best. Very fascinating topic. Yes, you had a question.
No, I didn't have a question. I wanted to comment on what he is saying. I went for imaging and we had indicators. So there's things that they wrote for to say this is not somebody wrote to say we will not run for insurance. So there's certain things, or the way the cover is moving, there's a couple of things that they check technically that are trained to do, to check if the driver was drunk. So maybe you can go to RTMC and ask them if you want to develop something to assist for road safety, because I'm also looking at something for road safety.
Yes, I agree. I think I'll be with you now. I think there's a human aspect before the technical aspect. Let's go back a few hundred years. People sewed by hand, right? And then somebody said, you know, we are now in the mechanical age. We can make a machine to do this. But before that, before they could do that, they had to know exactly what you do when you sew. Your stitches change size. Sometimes you go backwards. So I agree, you would have to find out, I think, from human people, what are some of the things they look for, the symptoms and that. So that's a very good suggestion. And then you try to write, so you'll definitely have some human contact, probably in the form of interviews and in the form of reading, and then you would develop your prototype. But you would have to get the real world manual process first, just like somebody who designed the sewing machine had to know all about sewing by hand first. Okay, I saw a hand over here. Yes?
I just wanted to know if each and every research has to have a ethical clearance. Even if you're using your own data, you generate your own data and use it. So you still have to have...
Yeah, well, I cannot speak for TUT. I come from UNISA and everything has it. And you know, we have all the engineers, we have the physicists and the chemists in science working in their labs with chemicals, right? And they say, I don't need ethical clearance, all I'm doing is I'm mixing chemicals. But they still have to fill in what UNISA calls the short ethical clearance, and it is a checklist. It's, do you do this? No, 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 no. No animals, no sensitive issues, no human. It's just my control. But as a matter of fact, the ethical clearance would be required. You would answer no to all of those. But sometimes the issue arises as to whose institution, whose chemicals. We often find that between universities, somebody can't get the chemicals or the engineering equipment they want at their university, so they will maybe go to UJ or come to TUT and use other labs. Immediately, that does bring in an ethical clearance. But if you're saying if everything is yours, everything you do, you can do in your own study, but I think you would still fill in a checklist and just answer no to all of those questions. But as soon as you're doing chemistry with chemicals and you go to another lab because they've got better facilities, immediately the whole ethical clearance issue comes in. Safety, ownership, all sorts of things. When ethical clearance started, it seemed so simple, but it kind of grows. And I am absolutely sure your university will want some form, whether it's the short form or the long one. Okay, to move on then, very important thing. The middle bullet is so important. Have a look at that one. Related work by other researchers. What other people have done something similar to what you're doing Maybe not on the same piece of machinery, but something else. Let's say we talked about technology acceptance of an learning environment, but maybe somebody did technology acceptance of another kind of app, let's say a banking app on a smartphone, and therefore that work would hold relevance. So you look at what other people did and you can use it for two things as a foundation, to say that Mkhize did this, Mbeki did that, and then you build on that, you take it further, but also to show the need for your distinct work, gap identification. I could find no literature that addressed exactly this problem. I can assure you, if you're working with learning on a smartphone, you will find a lot of studies. But if you do something different, you may find you don't find anything, and more about that later. Gap identification, and that's what the literature helps us with. The last one is simply this, that literature is not just a background. In many cases, the literature is your data, particularly if you're doing a conceptual or philosophical study, then the literature is actually your primary data. For most empirical, experimental survey studies, the literature is secondary data. It helps us move on. But in other cases, it is actually the material for your very first interpretations and data. In fact, when you compare your results with somebody else, then you are using that data that was secondary data, you're using it as primary. So what I'm saying is that literature is not just a background. Sometimes it actually gives us real data. I told you right at the beginning that when you collect and analyze your data, we can call it results. If a study is qualitative, we do tend to call it findings. Results is very good for quantitative work. It's all numbers. Here are results. They are measurements. But when you're doing a qualitative study, we very often call them findings. The data collection section presents the data you got in your empirical study. That section often uses a lot of tables. Tables are a very nice way to present data, and a lot more about tables coming up in the next slide. For qualitative data, I'm jumping to the bottom. When your data is textual, you look for themes and patterns. And very often we use software like Atlas TI, which is a great help if you're using a grounded theory approach to analysis. But when we go to quantitative, I'm moving to the one up, then it's statistical analysis with the SPOS system. A lot of us know how to use it ourselves, but very often that's where we call on a statistician as well for the expert advice, because you don't want to make a mistake in your statistical analysis. On that very first slide I showed you, I said one of the things that you deal with is interpretation and discussion. Some people have a separate chapter or a huge section in the data chapter in which they deal with interpretation. But very often, the discussion and interpretation are integrated into your results. So you might have a table of results with discussion underneath it. The next set of results, discussion underneath it. And maybe in the interpretation, you might well compare it with somebody else's finding. Examiners love that. You will say, one of the very interesting things that I did, and I was actually, it's a while ago, first person at UNISA to have an academic online discussion forum on Facebook. And so when I was looking the other day at the citations I had on that, there was somebody else who discussed my work and then said his findings were in line with de Villiers' finding. And examiners really do like it. Or you can say, these findings are in complete contrast with Scott's findings. But this could be due to the fact that he worked with a large sample of population, whereas I worked with 10 people doing interviews. So that sort of thing is very nice to actually refer back and show how your work fits into the body of the knowledge. But in some cases, people like to have a separate chapter. What does the conclusion have? Definitely a summary of what you did and an overview. But if this is now your dissertation, not your proposal. Remember, in your proposal, you don't have any answers. You're going to talk about how you will collect data. But you didn't collect any, not at that stage, so you don't have results. But remember what I said, all of these studies, all of these PowerPoints are your take-home to look at when the time comes. Promise yourself that they won't just go into a dusty corner of your C drive, that you will use them when you're actually writing. Because it's very important in the conclusion, even though your data collection probably answered your research question and sub-questions. It's very important in the conclusion just to revisit each research question or sub-question and give us a very quick summary of the answer. I'm not talking about going on and on. I'm talking about briefly answering it and then a backwards cross-reference, say, for example, to section 4.2.1, where this was actually solved. If you did have an underlying theoretical model, conceptual model, framework, go for it. Remind us how your work adhered to it. Please remember your research design must pervade your study. Don't just go sticking your research design and your underlying frameworks in your research design chapter. And I have marked dissertations where that happened. You know what, then I never heard about it again. They collected all their data. Sure, they were using that model. They were. But just make it explicit. If you are using TAM, Technology Acceptance Model, you would show the basic TAM by Davis or his second or third versions. But then somewhere in the data collection, you would put in your model, which was slightly adapted, and you would say based on Davis's original model of whatever year. So if you have a theoretical framework, conceptual model, a research design, action research, design research, grounded theory, you refer to it. Just remind us. We're not talking about long stories, but just a sentence or two in line with the action research approach that our following was done. So your conclusion chapter just wraps up and reminds the reader of all the things you did. And it's also like a confirmation to yourself. Yeah, okay, I was on track, right? Then you talk about the contribution of your study. If you're doing a doctorate, it's nice to have at least two, because there can be a theoretical contribution to the body of knowledge, or there can be a practical contribution because you made a prototype, you simulated something, you found out information, you actually found out what is the attitude of students to an learning environment on their smartphone. So everywhere they go, they take their university with them. Maybe they don't like it. So you get the idea. They can even do it on the bus, in a train. They can sit and go through their work. But some people will say, no, you know, I've worked hard all day. Just give me a chance, a moment of freedom. It's this type of thing. So what you do is you say, practical contribution. I found out that. And methodological. That doesn't often happen with a master's, but sometimes with a PhD. And Prof. Etienne is a very notable example because he used a variant of design research, but he took design research models and he adjusted them, he combined things from this and from that, and he developed his own model. So he made a methodological contribution as well. I would not expect that to come from a master's degree, but for example, and I know somebody now who's been studying business transactions in a rural area, and you had to talk to those people in a different way. So their data collection involved sketches, diagrams, translators, qualitative work, but some groundbreaking stuff in which the participants were actually asked to draw something. You see, so now that was in a PhD. That is a very big methodological contribution. Then you end up your research, of course, with recommendations, and you wrap it all up with that famous paragraph. And let me say in a tongue-in-cheek way, I'm not sure how often this actually happens, but we all say further research would be appropriate, and the further research would be this and this, and you wonder, does it ever happen? Well, a lot of people do recommend further research, and then they go from their M and they actually do it themselves in their PhD. Or other people see it. Or somebody else might take what you did, but do it in a different domain. For example, you might do road to rail in South Africa. Somebody else might do road to rail on the international routes, goods from the copper mines of Zambia down to South Africa. How about that? That probably is better by rail, because it's a long way. So you see, further research, you could say somebody else could use my study, but in a different context or a different environment. That's it, and what's that? Yeah, that's our golden thread. Now, this is where, yes.
I see you skip background there. Is it not important?
I beg your pardon?
I'm saying from the slides. So there's an introduction, literature review, and other. But I see you skip background. Is it not?
Oh, did I skip background? Yes. Sorry about that. Let's go back to it quickly. Okay. Yes. I did touch on gap identification. Why is this work needed? Well, there are very often three reasons. The one is that it was addressed in the literature. In that famous future research, perhaps somebody explicitly said, there is a need for a study of this kind. Now that, of course, is the nicest possible gap identification you can have, because you actually find 2 or 3 people who say this research should be done. So, wow, pat on the back, I did my gap identification very quickly. Very often it's not like that. You actually have to look for the literature, and then you see there is a lack. People have done this and that on a smartphone, but nobody has done this. So there's a gap, and that is a gap that I intend to fill. So it would be substantiated by references to related work and other researchers who expressed the need, but also you would give the details of the problem that you are addressing and point out, second bullet, that there is a specific need. And that's why you're doing it, because there isn't enough literature on that. As far as the environment goes, then that's where you would talk about your environment. So if you're doing this road to rail stuff, you're going to do it on the Joburg factories to Durban ship outlets, or you're doing it in something else. Or if you are going to design a prototype to work on a factory process line, you would talk about the process line as a whole, and then home in on the part for which you wanted to make a prototype. Okay, background all right. And for those of you who came in later, you will get all of these slides in due course. Okay, yes?
Yes, ma'am. Coming to your section, we're talking about contribution to research.
Say that again?
Coming back to the contribution.
Yeah, theoretical, practical, methodological, yes.
At doctoral level, how appropriate is it for you to use to come up with theoretical contribution? How easy is it to demonstrate? Can you explain?
If you're adding something, okay, let's take Prof. Etienne's work. He worked on virtual reality for minors, right? And so he came up with a lot of guidelines for actually designing such, but more important, he came up with an evaluation framework with a whole lot of criteria. And this thing could be used by other people, or it could be customized. So there was a huge theoretical contribution he added to the body of knowledge. Some people, if you are doing conceptual or philosophical work, but nobody here is a PhD, am I right? Anybody doing PhD? No, all masters. So I don't think that you will be doing philosophical, conceptual, or purely theoretical work. If you are, then obviously your contribution is theoretical. But for the rest of us, our study may have the practical results, which are very informative, the results. But maybe what you did was you also added to the body of knowledge in bringing in guidelines or an evaluation framework, and then you made a theoretical contribution. If it's a master's degree study, it's really fine to make one, but sometimes people give their results and that's their practical contribution, and then I actually say to them, but you know what? You have added to the body of knowledge. So you made a theoretical as well, and that's something you will find out as you go on.